Nunavut in Canada's north is literally sitting on a gold mine. No, wait. 3 gold mines that in 2019 alone brought in $850 million. Nunavut's rich in all kinds of resources: iron, uranium, zinc, nickel, great for the electric car market. But you know how much the territorial government would get when those resources are extracted? Nothing. It's been like that for years, but that will change.
Nunavut is marking a huge milestone today, one that takes us toward independence from the federal government.
Yes, the federal government is relinquishing control. The fancy term for that is devolution. Basically, the transfer of power and decision-making from the federal government to the territory.
It's really the last major province-like authority that is being transferred from the federal government.
And that has real dollars and cents implications for all of us. So a good place to start is the question of why Nunavut doesn't already have control over its own natural resources. Well, geography is a big part of it. If you're not from Canada, you may not know that Nunavut is a huge chunk of land up north, bigger than any US state, bigger than Alaska, with very few roads, a massive coastline, and yet a relatively small population living in disconnected communities. Even after it formally became its own territory 25 years ago, Nunavut wasn't entirely the master of its own land. The federal government was in charge of roughly 80%. The other 20% went to Inuit through a land claim. But that 80% the federal government was responsible for, it believed that only it should administer things like land and resource development, and that full self-governance for the territory would take time.
Paternalism on the part of Ottawa was a long time thing. But the other one was that northern communities, both the territories but also the Indigenous communities, were very worried about being saddled with responsibilities without the resources to do it properly.
Resource development is really the last of the powers that remained with the federal government, which, from the territory's perspective, has been a really contentious thing. I mean, just think about it. It basically meant that when it came to natural resources, a federal minister who might live thousands of kilometers away in Ottawa would have more say than an MLA who actually lives and works in Nunavut. I'll give you an example. In 2014, an iron ore mining company proposed a big expansion on Baffin Island, one that would have seen it triple its output. Nunavut's planning commission said no. Doesn't work. It would have meant much more traffic, both on land and at sea. But in a controversial move, the federal government kind of circumvented Nunavut's planning commission, granting the company an exemption, bypassing Nunavut's regulations, going directly against the recommendations. Now, in the end, fast forward a few years, a change in government later, that project didn't go through. But still, it shows how this kind of relationship between the federal government and the territory can be really challenging.
Residents of the territory didn't have the same rights as provincial citizens. You know, they vote for a government that doesn't have the power to decide, participate in managing the land and resources. That was done in faraway, colonial, distant Ottawa.
That's Dennis Patterson, by the way. He's a former senator from Nunavut, and he's been working on getting this devolution agreement passed for years now.
It's been a sticking point in the north that we don't have the say in managing our resources.
So how does devolution actually unfold? Like, what do the two sides agree to? Well, I should say, this is just the start of a very long process, 3 years, to hash these things out, covering big areas like wildlife, environment, and yes, resource development. And a big part of that resource development conversation has been what to do with royalties. Because if a company comes along and says, hey, British Columbia, we'd like to cut some trees down on public land, the province effectively charges for that, right? And in BC, just to use that example, that adds up to billions of dollars in revenue.
Nunavut has diamond potential. In fact, there's a project that De Beers holds on Baffin Island. It's sort of in abeyance right now, but we certainly know there's diamonds there. So in the future, if diamond mining goes ahead, then those royalties would go to the government of Nunavut.
So they will get the lion's share of resource revenues, and they will be able to use those resource revenues to offset costs of housing and health as they see fit.
Now, of course, this is a much more complex financial arrangement than just, okay, Nunavut, you handle everything, so you get everything. Because Nunavut also receives annual transfer payments from Ottawa. Next year, projected to be just over $2 billion.
The issue here is that the territories are too small, the responsibility is too big, the geography too large, and the unique circumstances too profound to allow sort of standard southern provincial financial arrangements from working.
So there's a whole formula for how Nunavut can keep 100% of the royalties up to a limit, something like $9 million, before Ottawa starts to reduce the size of the transfer payments. But the net gain is still supposed to be in Nunavut's favor.
Now the territorial government has a real incentive to find ways to mitigate impacts and make developments succeed.
The list of next steps is lengthy. For example, as part of the devolution process, the federal government has to remediate all federal lands that are contaminated before transferring them back to the territory. These are old abandoned mines, construction sites, military bases, equipment left behind, contaminants that can seep into the ground and the water. It can cost millions to clean up.
There's quite a good deal of attention been given to an orderly way of addressing those contaminated sites, which are really inherited from the federal government's management of our lands and resources.
And of course, you can't just transfer these powers and responsibilities without actually transferring a workforce to maintain all of it, right? And everything that comes with it. Office buildings, warehouses, staff housing. It's all transferring to the territorial government. And this is actually one of the biggest hurdles. Nunavut needs to make sure that it has the workforce to do the work the federal government currently does, some of which is done from Ottawa, thousands of kilometers away. Do those people relocate, or does Nunavut have to find some other way to fill dozens of critical jobs?
That's why there's a 3-year transition, so that it will allow time for people to get trained up in land and resource management, environmental sciences, fields related to the management of lands and resources. That's a big challenge.
And though there's broad agreement about the direction of the deal, there are some very big disagreements too. Offshore development is a big one. That's next on the table to negotiate. In the past, Ottawa has been against offshore oil and gas drilling in the Arctic, banning it. Nunavut's premier at the time called that colonialism.
So now the people who will be making those decisions will be residents of Nunavut.
All of this to say that this is a very complex process, and it really is just the start. Again, 3 years to make all of this happen, to hash out the fine details of how it would actually work. The road ahead is long, but this is also undoubtedly the beginning of a new future for Nunavut.